What would you do if someone mocked your dignity in public and no one stood up for you? When an elderly woman is humiliated by an arrogant cop at the grocery store, a young cashier risks everything to defend her. But this act of courage triggers a chain of events that shakes the entire town. Who will stand for what's right? And how will one act of kindness transform lives forever? Stay tuned for a story of redemption, resilience, and the power of standing up for others. The late afternoon sun streamed through the narrow window of a small, worn home nestled in the heart of a Tennessee town. The soft golden light seemed to mock the dim reality within. Eleanor Ellie Harper, a 75-year-old black woman, stood in her modest kitchen, staring blankly at the grocery list clutched in her weathered hand. Her fingers trembled slightly, the paper crinkling in response. At the bottom of the list, scrawled in her shaky handwriting, were the words she dreaded most: adult diapers. Her chest tightened as she set the list down on the counter. In the next room, her husband, Henry Harper, lay in a hospital bed that dominated their tiny living space. Once a robust steelworker, Henry had been confined to that bed ever since a devastating stroke had left him paralyzed. The man who once stood tall and proud, with hands calloused from years of hard labor, now relied on Ellie for everything. The contrast between who he had been and who he was now was a daily weight she carried in silence. Ellie moved slowly toward Henry, her joints aching with every step. The years had not been kind to her body, and the constant strain of caregiving had taken its toll. She reached for the edge of his bed, leaning over to adjust the thin blanket that had slipped from his chest. Henry's eyes, still sharp and expressive, locked onto hers. Though he couldn't speak, his gaze conveyed a wealth of emotions: gratitude, love, and a sadness that mirrored her own. "I'm heading to the store, Henry," Ellie said softly, her voice tinged with weariness. She tried to smile, but it faltered under the weight of the task ahead. "We're out of, you know." Her words trailed off, her eyes flickering to the empty pack of diapers on the nightstand. She hated saying the words, hated how they made her feel: ashamed, vulnerable, exposed. Henry's eyes softened, and he gave her the smallest of nods. It was his way of reassuring her, of reminding her that they were in this together, no matter how hard it got. Ellie leaned down, pressing a kiss to his forehead, her lips lingering for a moment longer than usual. "I'll be back soon," she whispered, though the thought of leaving the house filled her with dread. Gathering her purse and reusable shopping bags, Ellie made her way to the door. Her hand hesitated on the doorknob as a familiar wave of anxiety washed over her. She could already feel the stares she would receive at the store, the silent judgments of strangers as she placed the package of diapers on the conveyor belt, the whispers that would follow her as she walked through the aisles. She closed her eyes, inhaling deeply, trying to summon the strength to face it all once again. Finally, she opened the door, stepping into the warm embrace of the late afternoon. The world outside was quiet, save for the distant hum of cars and the occasional bark of a neighbor's dog. The familiar sights of her neighborhood offered little comfort today. The weathered houses lined the street like old friends who had grown tired of fighting the same battles. Ellie's own home, with its peeling paint and sagging roof, was a reflection of her life, a testament to endurance rather than ease. As she made her way down the sidewalk, her steps slow and deliberate, Ellie couldn't help but think of the life she and Henry used to have. Before the stroke, before the diapers, before the world seemed to shrink around them. Back then, Henry had been her rock, her partner in every sense of the word. Together, they had weathered storms of all kinds: financial struggles, family disputes, even the sting of prejudice that had been a constant undercurrent in their lives. But now, the weight of their survival rested squarely on her shoulders, and there were days when it felt almost unbearable. When she arrived at Ray's Market, Ellie hesitated outside the door, her hand hovering over the handle. The bell above the entrance jingled faintly as she stepped inside, the cool air conditioning a stark contrast to the warmth outside. The store was mostly empty, save for a few scattered shoppers and the bored-looking cashier at the front. Ellie immediately dropped her gaze to the floor, hoping to make her trip as quick and inconspicuous as possible. She navigated the narrow aisles with practiced precision, her feet carrying her to the hygiene section almost on autopilot. The shelves loomed around her, their fluorescent lit displays a harsh reminder of her purpose. When she reached the diapers, Ellie paused, glancing over her shoulder to ensure she was alone. Her hands shook as she grabbed the package, the crinkling plastic sounding deafening in the otherwise silent aisle. Her heart raced as she clutched the package to her chest, as if holding it closer might somehow shield her from the shame it brought. Ellie hurried toward the checkout, her steps quickening with each passing moment. She could feel the weight of imagined stares pressing down on her, though she dared not look up to confirm them. The line at the counter was mercifully short, just a woman with a cart full of produce and a man in uniform standing a few places behind her. She exhaled shakily, relief washing over her as she realized she might be able to escape unnoticed. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. As Ellie placed the diapers on the conveyor belt, the man in uniform spoke, his voice loud and jovial. "Well, look at that," he said, chuckling as he leaned closer to his companion. "Guess some people never grow out of needing these, huh?" The words hit Ellie like a physical blow. Her breath caught in her throat as her face flushed with heat. She froze, her eyes glued to the diapers as if willing them to disappear. Around her, the murmurs of other customers filled the air, their voices tinged with amusement or discomfort. The humiliation was suffocating, a crushing weight that made her wish the floor would open up and swallow her whole. "Maybe they should have a special line for people like her," the man added, his laughter echoing in the small store. "Keep them out of the way of the rest of us." Ellie's hands trembled as she gripped the handle of her cart, her knuckles turning white. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, to explain that the diapers weren't for her, that they were for Henry, her husband, her heart. But the words wouldn't come. Her throat tightened, and her vision blurred as tears threatened to spill. It was in that moment, when Ellie felt she could endure no more, that a voice cut through the oppressive haze of her shame. "That's enough." The words were calm but firm, carrying a quiet authority that silenced the store. Ellie's head jerked up, her tear-filled eyes searching for the source. It was the cashier, a young man with kind eyes and an air of quiet strength. He looked directly at the man in uniform, his expression unyielding. "She doesn't deserve to be treated like this," the cashier said, his voice steady. "No one does." The store fell into a stunned silence. Ellie's heart pounded in her chest as she looked at the young man, her humiliation momentarily eclipsed by a flicker of gratitude. For the first time in what felt like forever, someone had seen her, not as an object of pity or ridicule, but as a person worthy of dignity and respect. The fluorescent lights above cast a harsh glare over the narrow aisles of Ray's Market, accentuating the worn tiles and faded signs. Ellie Harper maneuvered her cart with deliberate slowness, trying to blend into the background. Her shoulders hunched as though they could shield her from the invisible weight of judgment she always felt in public spaces. It was an ordinary grocery store, filled with the mundane hum of shoppers going about their business, but to Ellie, it felt like walking into a battlefield. The package of adult diapers nestled in her cart was a glaring reminder of the vulnerability she tried so hard to hide. Her heart raced with every step closer to the checkout counter, and though she kept her gaze fixed downward, she could feel the occasional glance of another shopper brushing against her like a cold wind. Were they looking at her? Did they see? These questions echoed relentlessly in her mind. She gripped the handle of the cart tighter, her knuckles whitening. Each step forward was like crossing an invisible threshold, a test of her resilience against the small, cutting indignities that life seemed determined to pile on her. The aisle stretched endlessly before her, though she knew it was only a few more feet to the register. Her breath quickened, and her chest tightened as the inevitability of being seen, truly seen, loomed nearer. Ellie's path to the checkout line brought her closer to a group of customers clustered near the bakery section. Among them was a man whose voice cut through the low hum of the store like the crack of a whip. "Looks like the department's been good to me this week," he said loudly, laughter following his words. "Big weekend coming up, and I'm not spending it sober." Ellie's eyes flickered toward him involuntarily. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore the crisp navy uniform of a police officer. His badge gleamed under the store's lights, and his belt sagged slightly under the weight of his equipment. His name tag read, Bradley Warren, though the self-assured swagger in his stance made introductions unnecessary. The way he spoke, his voice brimming with arrogance, told Ellie everything she needed to know about him. Bradley turned to the woman beside him, a younger officer in training, and flashed a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "That's the problem with these small-town gigs," he said. "Nothing exciting ever happens. I'm almost rooting for someone to speed past a stop sign, just to break up the monotony." The woman laughed uneasily, clearly unsure of how to respond. Bradley seemed to enjoy her discomfort, leaning in closer to emphasize his point. His loud, self-serving banter filled the air, turning heads as he reveled in the attention. Ellie's stomach knotted as she realized she'd have to pass him to reach the checkout. She quickened her pace, hoping to slip by unnoticed. But fate rarely favored Ellie in moments like these. As she rounded the corner, pushing her cart into the line at the register, Bradley's sharp eyes caught sight of her. His gaze drifted to the package of adult diapers sitting in her cart, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. Well, well, he drawled, loud enough for the entire line to hear. What do we have here? Ellie froze. Her heart hammered in her chest, and her palms grew clammy around the cart's handle. She didn't look at him, but she could feel his eyes on her, probing, mocking, stripping away the last shreds of her dignity. Bradley chuckled, nudging his companion with his elbow. Guess some folks never grow out of needing these, huh? He pointed at the diapers in her cart, his voice dripping with condescension. Poor lady probably doesn't even know what day it is. The trainee officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Bradley and Ellie. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but quickly closed it, her gaze dropping to the floor. The other customers in the line murmured softly, their reactions a mix of awkward laughter and silent discomfort. Ellie's cheeks burned with humiliation. Her grip on the cart tightened as her vision blurred. She fought the urge to run, to abandon the cart and bolt for the exit, but the image of Henry at home, waiting for her, anchored her in place. He needed those diapers, and she wouldn't let her pride stop her from providing for him. Bradley wasn't done. Maybe they should have a special line for folks like her, he said, smirking as he gestured toward Ellie. You know, keep things moving faster for the rest of us. The humiliation cut through her like a blade. Her throat tightened, and she blinked rapidly to keep the tears at bay. She focused on her breathing, on the dull gray tiles beneath her feet, anything to block out the sound of Bradley's voice. One by one, the other customers in the line began to shift their focus to her. Some averted their eyes, pretending not to notice. Others stole quick, curious glances, their faces betraying a mix of pity and discomfort. The silence that followed Bradley's words felt heavier than his mockery, a suffocating reminder of how invisible she was to the world unless she became an object of ridicule. Ellie's trembling hands reached for the package of diapers. She placed them on the conveyor belt, her movements mechanical, as though detaching herself from the moment might spare her from the sharp edge of its pain. But no matter how much she tried to retreat inward, the humiliation clung to her like a shadow, inescapable and unrelenting. Bradley leaned back against the counter behind him, folding his arms with a satisfied smirk. Must be rough, he said, his tone laced with mock sympathy. Getting old's a real pain, huh? The cashier, a young man with kind eyes and a name tag that read Isaac, hesitated as he scanned Ellie's items. His movements were deliberate, his lips pressed into a thin line. He glanced at Ellie briefly, his gaze flickering with concern, before returning to his task. Ellie's head remained bowed. She couldn't meet his gaze, or anyone else's. She felt like a glass figurine about to shatter, every harsh word and every sideways glance chipping away at the fragile shell of her composure. The line inched forward, but time felt like it had stopped. Ellie's world had narrowed to the sound of Bradley's voice, the oppressive heat of the stairs around her, and the growing lump in her throat that she couldn't swallow away. As Bradley continued his barrage of cruel commentary, Ellie's thoughts drifted to Henry. She thought of the man who had once held her hand so tightly during their hardest moments. She thought of his gentle smile, his quiet strength, and the love that had carried them through decades of hardships. She clung to that image, willing it to fortify her as she endured the worst of Bradley's taunts. Maybe they should start selling bibs with those diapers, Bradley added with a laugh, his words cutting through her like shards of glass. You know, just to cover all the bases. The laughter that followed felt like nails on a chalkboard. Ellie bit her lip, fighting the tears that threatened to spill. Her knees felt weak, her chest heavy. All she wanted was for this nightmare to end. As she reached the counter, the cashier's steady voice broke through the haze of her shame. Ma'am, Isaac said softly, his tone careful, would you like some help with your bags? Ellie glanced up, her vision swimming. Isaac's expression was neutral, but there was something in his eyes, something understanding, something kind. It was a lifeline in a sea of mockery, a moment of dignity she hadn't expected. She nodded mutely, her voice refusing to cooperate. Isaac bagged her items quickly and efficiently, his hands moving with a precision that seemed almost deliberate. Ellie clutched the bags to her chest as though they were a shield, murmuring a barely audible, "Thank you," before turning toward the exit. The moment she stepped outside, the weight of the encounter hit her fully, and a single tear slid down her cheek. The fresh air was a relief, but the ache in her heart lingered. She didn't look back. The faint beep of the scanner punctuated the tense atmosphere in the store, its rhythm steady and deliberate. Isaac Thompson, the cashier stationed at the front of Ray's Market, had been watching the scene unfold with growing unease. His hands moved mechanically, scanning Ellie's items, but his attention was wholly absorbed by the mocking laughter and cruel remarks of the police officer a few feet away. Isaac was no stranger to conflict. At 28 years old, he had seen his fair share of confrontation, Not just in this small-town grocery store, but in the years he had spent serving overseas in the military. Those years had left their mark. A scar near his temple, a dull ache in his knee from an old injury, and a burden heavier than either of those, a persistent battle with PTSD. Since returning to civilian life, he had learned to keep his head down, to avoid situations that might trigger memories he'd worked so hard to bury. But as Bradley Warren's jeering voice rose above the quiet murmur of the store, something in Isaac began to stir. He glanced at Eleanor Harper, the elderly woman standing at his register. Her shoulders were hunched, her head bowed, and her trembling hands clutched the bags of groceries as though they were the only thing keeping her grounded. She looked as though she might disappear under the weight of the officer's words. "Guess that's what happens when you get old, huh?" Bradley sneered. "Start acting like a baby all over again." The chuckles that followed grated on Isaac's nerves. He looked around, hoping someone, anyone, might step in to put an end to it. But the other customers avoided eye contact, their discomfort clear in their stiff postures and diverted gazes. Even Bradley's younger colleague seemed hesitant, her lips pressing into a thin line as she shuffled awkwardly in place. Isaac's jaw tightened. He had been in that position before, helpless, humiliated, enduring the sharp sting of someone else's cruelty while the world pretended not to notice. He recognized the look in Ellie's eyes, the silent plea for it to end. And for reasons he couldn't fully explain, he knew he couldn't let it continue. Taking a steadying breath, Isaac placed the last of Ellie's items into a bag and straightened his posture. His voice, when he spoke, was calm but firm. "That's enough." The 3 words sliced through the air like a blade. The laughter stopped abruptly, and all eyes turned to him. Bradley's smug grin faltered as he turned toward Isaac, his brows furrowing in confusion. "What was that?" Bradley asked, his tone incredulous, as though the idea of being challenged was utterly foreign to him. Isaac met his gaze evenly, his expression unyielding. "I said that's enough," he repeated. "You've made your point. Now leave her alone." The silence that followed was deafening. Ellie froze, her wide eyes darting between Isaac and Bradley. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Someone was standing up for her. Her initial relief was quickly overshadowed by a new wave of anxiety. She could see the tension building in Bradley's posture, the way his jaw clenched and his fists tightened at his sides. "Who do you think you're talking to?" Bradley demanded, taking a step closer to the counter. He loomed over Isaac, his imposing figure a stark contrast to the cashier's lean frame. "You know who I am, right? I could make your life a whole lot harder if I wanted to." Isaac didn't flinch. His heart was pounding, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had faced worse than this before. Men with weapons, men with power. Bradley's badge might have given him authority, but it didn't give him the right to belittle an innocent woman. "I know exactly who you are," Isaac replied, his tone measured. "You're someone who's supposed to protect people, not humiliate them. What you're doing right now? It's wrong, and you know it." A ripple of murmurs spread through the small crowd of onlookers. Some nodded subtly in agreement, while others watched the exchange with wide-eyed fascination. Bradley's face reddened, a vein in his temple pulsing as his anger mounted. "You better watch your mouth, kid," Bradley said, his voice low and threatening. "You don't want to mess with me." Isaac didn't back down. He held Bradley's gaze, his own voice unwavering. "No, I don't. But someone had to say something. What you're doing isn't right, and you need to stop." For a moment, it seemed as though Bradley might lash out. His fists twitched at his sides, and his glare bore into Isaac like a challenge. But then, slowly, he stepped back, his lips curling into a bitter sneer. "You think you're some kind of hero, huh?" he spat. "Let me tell you something. You're nothing. Just a lowly cashier trying to act like you're better than me. But you're not." With that, he turned on his heel and strode toward the exit, his boots echoing loudly against the tile floor. The younger officer hesitated, casting an apologetic glance toward Ellie and Isaac before hurrying after him. The bell above the door jingled as they left, the sound somehow both relieving and unsettling. The store remained silent for a moment longer, the tension lingering like an uninvited guest. Isaac exhaled quietly, his shoulders relaxing slightly as he turned his attention back to Ellie. "Ma'am," he said softly, his voice regaining its usual gentleness. "Are you okay?" Ellie nodded slowly, though her hands were still trembling. She clutched her bags tightly, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Thank you for standing up for me." Isaac offered her a small, reassuring smile. It was the right thing to do. But as Ellie walked out of the store, her heart heavy with both gratitude and worry, she couldn't shake the feeling that there would be consequences for Isaac's courage. She had seen the anger in Bradley's eyes, the way his ego had been bruised, and she feared that the young cashier, who had risked so much to defend her, might soon pay the price. Inside the store, Isaac watched her leave, his calm exterior masking the storm of emotions churning inside him. He knew he had done the right thing, but a small voice in the back of his mind reminded him of the fragile balance he had been trying to maintain since returning to this small town. He had made a choice, a bold, necessary choice, but he couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling that Bradley wasn't the type to let things go. For now, though, the air felt a little lighter. Isaac took a deep breath, steadying himself as he returned to his work. Whatever came next, he told himself, he would face it, just as he had faced Bradley, just as he had faced every other challenge life had thrown his way. Isaac had barely returned to his post behind the counter when the sharp voice of the store manager, Victor Graves, sliced through the lingering tension. "Isaac, in the back! Now!" Victor barked, his tone clipped and laced with impatience. Isaac's stomach sank. He knew what was coming. He cast a quick glance around the store. Ellie was gone, and the remaining customers were avoiding his eyes, pretending to be engrossed in their shopping. Isaac sighed and made his way to the small, cluttered office at the back of the store, his steps heavy with apprehension. Victor was pacing when Isaac entered, his thinning hair glistening with sweat. The man looked frazzled, as though the confrontation with Bradley had shaken him just as much, if not more, than Isaac. He gestured for Isaac to close the door, and Isaac obeyed, leaning back against it with his arms crossed. "What the hell were you thinking?" Victor snapped, his voice low but seething with frustration. "You don't talk to a customer like that, especially not a cop." Isaac held his ground, his face impassive. With all due respect, Mr. Graves, he wasn't just a customer. He was humiliating an elderly woman in front of everyone. Someone had to stand up for her. Victor's face reddened. "I get it, okay? But do you have any idea what kind of trouble this could bring on the store? Bradley Warren isn't just any cop. He's well connected. His brother's the sheriff, for crying out loud. Do you think he's going to let this go?" Isaac remained silent, the weight of Victor's words settling over him. He had known there might be consequences, but he hadn't considered how far Bradley's reach could extend. Victor continued, his frustration mounting. "We've already had customers call to complain. People are saying the store shouldn't let employees mouth off to law enforcement. And what do you think Bradley's going to do? He's going to make sure we pay for this." Isaac clenched his jaw, his hands tightening into fists at his sides. "So, what are you saying? That I should have just stood by and let him keep mocking her?" Victor stopped pacing and fixed Isaac with a tired, exasperated look. "I'm saying you should have thought about the bigger picture. We can't afford to lose customers over this. I can't afford it." He sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. "Look, Isaac, I'm under a lot of pressure here. The higher-ups aren't happy about this. They've told me I need to take action." Isaac's heart sank further. He had known this was coming, but hearing the words still hit like a blow to the gut. "I'm suspending you," Victor said finally, his tone grudging but firm. "Effective immediately. You'll be off the schedule until we can sort this out." Isaac inhaled sharply, the reality of the situation crashing down on him. "Suspending me? For what? For doing the right thing?" Victor threw up his hands. "Call it whatever you want. All I know is you've put this store in a bad position, and I've got to do what's best for business." Isaac's fists unclenched, his shoulders slumping as the fight drained out of him. He nodded once, curtly, and turned to leave without another word. Victor called after him, his voice tinged with a mix of frustration and guilt. "Isaac, this isn't personal. You're a good worker, but sometimes doing the right thing comes with consequences." Isaac didn't respond. He stepped out of the office, grabbed his coat from the break room, and walked out of the store. The bell above the door jingled faintly as it closed behind him, the sound feeling oddly final. Ellie's home. Back at home, Ellie carefully set the groceries on the counter, her movements slow and deliberate. Her mind was still replaying the events at the store, Bradley's mocking voice echoing in her ears. She shook her head, trying to push the memory away, but the knot of guilt in her stomach refused to loosen. In the living room, Henry lay in his hospital bed, his sharp eyes tracking her every move. He couldn't speak, but Ellie could feel his silent questions hanging in the air. She forced a small smile as she approached him, pulling a chair close to his bedside. "Oh, Henry," she said softly, her voice trembling. "You wouldn't believe what happened at the store today." She recounted the incident in halting detail, her voice breaking as she described Bradley's cruel words and Isaac's courageous stand. By the time she finished, tears were streaming down her face. She wiped them away quickly, embarrassed by her display of emotion. "That poor young man," she murmured, shaking her head. "He stood up for me, Henry. He didn't have to, but he did. And now I'm afraid he'll suffer because of it. Henry's brow furrowed, his eyes narrowing in thought. He lifted one hand slightly, his fingers twitching as though trying to reach for hers. Ellie took his hand gently, her thumb brushing over his knuckles. I feel like it's my fault, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. If I hadn't been there, if I hadn't needed those diapers, none of this would have happened. He wouldn't have had to risk his job for me. Henry squeezed her hand lightly, the small gesture speaking volumes. He held her gaze, his eyes filled with a quiet strength that Ellie had always admired. She could see the message he was trying to convey. This isn't your fault. Ellie sighed, her shoulders sagging. But what can I do, Henry? How can I make this right? Henry's expression softened, and he moved his hand slightly, gesturing toward the framed photograph on the nightstand. It was an old picture of the two of them, taken years ago at a community event where Henry had received an award for his work at the steel mill. The memory of that day, a day filled with pride, gratitude, and a sense of belonging, flooded Ellie's mind. She sat up straighter, a spark of determination igniting in her chest. You're right, Henry, she said, her voice firmer now. I can't just sit here feeling sorry for myself. That young man deserves better than this. He deserves someone to stand up for him, just like he stood up for me. Henry's eyes crinkled at the corners, his version of a smile. Ellie smiled back, her resolve hardening. She didn't know exactly what she would do yet, but she knew she had to try. Isaac had given her dignity in a moment when she felt utterly powerless, and now it was her turn to repay that kindness. As Ellie rose from her chair, her mind was already racing with possibilities. She glanced back at Henry, who watched her with an expression of quiet encouragement. Thank you, Henry, she said softly. You always know how to set me straight. Henry's fingers twitched in response, and Ellie felt a surge of gratitude for the man who had been her partner in life's battles for so many years. Together, they had faced more than their fair share of hardships, and though Henry's voice was now silent, his strength continued to guide her. Ellie turned toward the kitchen, her steps steadier than before. She didn't have a plan yet, but she knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't let Isaac's courage go unnoticed. The morning was gray and overcast as Ellie Harper walked down the cracked sidewalk toward the town's modest shopping district. She carried a worn tote bag on her arm, heading to the pharmacy to pick up Henry's medication. The air smelled faintly of rain, and a cool breeze brushed past her, tugging at her cardigan. Though her steps were steady, her mind was restless, filled with thoughts of the young cashier who had stood up for her just days ago. She hadn't seen Isaac since that fateful day at Ray's Market, but his courage and quiet dignity lingered in her thoughts. She had heard whispers from other shoppers that he had been suspended and possibly fired. The news gnawed at her, filling her with guilt and unease. A part of her wanted to march back to the store and demand answers, but she knew her words wouldn't change corporate decisions or mend the damage caused by Bradley Warren's ego. As Ellie turned the corner near the bus stop, she saw a figure slumped on the bench. Her heart skipped a beat. It was Isaac. His head was bowed, his elbows resting on his knees, and his hands hung limp between them. His once neatly trimmed hair was disheveled, and his clothes, while not filthy, showed signs of wear. Beside him sat a small duffel bag, scuffed and frayed at the edges. Ellie hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to approach him. He looked so lost, so far removed from the composed young man she had seen behind the counter. But the thought of leaving him there, alone and defeated, was unbearable. Summoning her courage, she stepped forward. Isaac? She called softly, her voice gentle but steady. He flinched at the sound of his name, his head snapping up. His eyes, hollow and rimmed with fatigue, met hers. For a brief moment, his face was blank, as if he didn't recognize her. Then his expression shifted. Embarrassment, shame, and something akin to relief all flickered across his features. Mrs. Harper, he said, his voice hoarse. He sat up straighter, forcing a weak smile. What are you doing here? I could ask you the same thing, Ellie replied, her tone laced with concern. She gestured to the bench. May I sit? Isaac hesitated before nodding. Ellie lowered herself carefully onto the bench beside him, her joints protesting the motion. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Ellie studied Isaac out of the corner of her eye, noting the tension in his posture and the way his fingers fidgeted with the frayed hem of his jacket. I heard about what happened at the store, she said gently, breaking the silence. I'm so sorry, Isaac, Her voice faltered as guilt clawed at her throat. I feel like it's my fault. Isaac shook his head firmly. It's not your fault, Mrs. Harper. Don't ever think that. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. Victor made his choice. He was worried about losing business, and I guess I gave him an excuse. Ellie frowned, her heart aching at the resignation in his voice. That's not fair, she said softly. You stood up for what was right. You shouldn't be punished for that. Isaac chuckled bitterly. Fair? That's not a word I hear much these days. He leaned back against the bench, his gaze fixed on the gray sky above. Truth is, losing that job was just the last straw. I've been hanging on by a thread for a while now. Ellie tilted her head, her brows furrowing in concern. What do you mean? Isaac hesitated, his jaw tightening as though he were debating whether to share the weight he had been carrying. But something in Ellie's patient, compassionate gaze seemed to break through his defenses. He exhaled slowly and began to speak. I used to be in the army, he said, his voice low. Signed up right out of high school. Thought I was doing something important, serving my country, making a difference. He paused, his eyes clouding with memory. But it wasn't what I expected. The things I saw, the things I had to do, they change you. Ellie nodded silently, giving him the space to continue. When I came back, I thought I could pick up where I left off. But it wasn't that simple. I couldn't sleep, couldn't think straight. And then he swallowed hard, his hands clenching into fists. While I was deployed, my fiancée, my high school sweetheart, decided she couldn't wait for me anymore. She left me. Said she couldn't handle the distance, the uncertainty. Ellie's chest tightened. Oh, Isaac, I'm so sorry. Isaac shrugged, but the pain in his eyes was unmistakable. After that, I started drinking. It helped me forget for a while, but it also made everything worse. I lost a good job because of it. Couldn't afford my apartment. Ended up crashing on friends' couches until they got tired of me. That part-time gig at Ray's Market? That was all I had left. And now? He gestured to the duffel bag at his feet. Here I am. Ellie's heart broke for him. She saw so much of Henry and Isaac, the same quiet strength, the same stubborn resilience. But while Henry had her to lean on, Isaac seemed to have no one. She couldn't bear the thought of him being alone, abandoned by the world he had once served so selflessly. Without fully thinking it through, Ellie reached out and placed a hand on Isaac's arm. Come home with me. Isaac blinked, startled. What? You heard me, Ellie said, her tone firm. Come home with me. Henry and I have a spare room. It's not much, but it's warm and it's safe. You'll have a roof over your head and a bed to sleep in. Isaac stared at her, disbelief etched across his face. Mrs. Harper, I can't accept that. You've already been through so much. I don't want to be a burden. You won't be a burden, Ellie insisted. You'll be helping me as much as I'll be helping you. Henry and I could use an extra set of hands around the house. And frankly, her voice softened, no one deserves to feel like they're going through this alone. Isaac looked away, his jaw working as he struggled to process her offer. Part of him wanted to refuse, to walk away and deal with his problems on his own. But another part, the part that had been yearning for connection, for kindness, found it impossible to say no. Are you sure? He asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Ellie nodded. I'm sure. For the first time in days, Isaac allowed himself to smile. It was small and tentative, but it held a flicker of hope. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Ellie replied, squeezing his arm gently. Let's just get you home. The rain began softly that evening, tapping lightly against the windows of Ellie Harper's modest home as Isaac stepped inside for the first time. The warm, inviting aroma of lavender air freshener mixed with the faint scent of homemade bread greeted him, a sharp contrast to the cold indifference of the streets. Ellie carefully closed the door behind them, her movements deliberate but fluid, as though trying not to startle him. Isaac stood awkwardly in the entryway, his duffel bag dangling from his hand, his shoes leaving faint, wet marks on the worn floor. It's not much, Ellie said, breaking the silence, but it's home. Isaac looked around, his eyes taking in the modest but meticulously cared-for living room. The faded couch near the window, the stack of well-worn books on the side table, and the old photos lining the walls spoke of a life built on love and resilience, rather than material wealth. His gaze lingered on the hospital bed in the corner, where Henry Harper lay motionless but alert, his sharp eyes fixed on the new arrival. Ellie stepped forward, her voice warm yet firm. Henry, this is Isaac, the young man I told you about. Isaac shifted uncomfortably under Henry's penetrating gaze. Unsure of what to say, he opted for the straightforward approach. It's an honor to meet you, sir, he said, his voice steady but tinged with nervousness. He straightened his posture instinctively, a remnant of his military training. Henry's lips curved ever so slightly into what might have been a smile. His eyes softened, and he gave a small, approving nod. Ellie beamed at the silent exchange, her relief palpable. She turned to Isaac, gesturing toward the hallway. "Let me show you to your room." Isaac followed her to a small, sparsely furnished bedroom at the end of the hall. The bed was neatly made with a faded quilt, and the lone window offered a view of the quiet backyard. A simple dresser and a wooden chair completed the space. Isaac set his duffel bag down, his movements tentative, as though afraid he might disturb the delicate balance of this home. "It's perfect," he said softly, his voice almost reverent. Ellie nodded, lingering in the doorway for a moment. She seemed to sense his unease and decided to give him space. "Make yourself comfortable. Dinner will be ready soon." Isaac sat on the edge of the bed after she left, his hands resting on his knees. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the rain outside. He closed his eyes, letting the unfamiliar sense of safety wash over him. It had been so long since he'd felt this. Welcomed, cared for, wanted. The days that followed brought a rhythm to the household that had been absent for years. Isaac threw himself into helping wherever he could, fixing a leaky faucet in the bathroom, clearing out a cluttered shed in the backyard, and even rearranging the kitchen cabinets to make them more accessible for Ellie. She watched him work with a mixture of gratitude and quiet amazement, noting how his hands seemed to steady when they had a purpose. Henry, too, benefited from Isaac's presence. The young man took over some of the more physically demanding aspects of Henry's care, lifting him gently from the bed to his wheelchair or adjusting his position to make him more comfortable. Though Henry couldn't speak, the small gestures of approval, a nod, a crinkling at the corners of his eyes, made it clear he appreciated Isaac's efforts. Despite the growing sense of belonging, Isaac couldn't entirely shake the gnawing feelings of shame and unworthiness that lingered in the corners of his mind. Late at night, when the house was quiet, he would sit in the darkened living room, staring out the window as memories from his past crept in. The faces of his comrades, the echo of his fiancée's parting words, the emptiness he felt returning to a world that no longer felt like home. It all weighed on him, threatening to pull him back into the darkness he had fought so hard to escape. One evening, Ellie found him sitting alone, his shoulders slumped and his head bowed. She approached quietly, a cup of tea in each hand, and settled into the chair beside him. The soft glow of the nearby lamp illuminated her kind but determined expression. "You've been working yourself ragged," she said gently, handing him a cup. "Even soldiers need rest." Isaac managed a small smile, accepting the tea with a nod. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the warmth of the tea and Ellie's presence easing some of the tension in his chest. Eventually, she spoke again. "You don't have to tell me what's weighing on you," she said softly, her gaze fixed on the rain streaking down the window. "But if you ever want to talk, I'm here." Isaac hesitated, the words caught in his throat. He had spent so long burying his pain, locking it away where no one could see. But Ellie's patience and kindness made it harder to keep the walls intact. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "I've made a lot of mistakes," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hurt people I cared about. Lost everything because I couldn't keep it together." Ellie turned to him, her expression compassionate but unwavering. "You're here now," she said simply. "That means something." Isaac looked down at his hands, the scars and calluses a testament to the battles he had fought, both on the battlefield and within himself. "I just don't want to be a burden," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "You and Mr. Harper, you've already been through so much." Ellie reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "Isaac, you're not a burden. You're family now." The words hit him like a tidal wave, breaking through the barriers he had carefully constructed. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that he might deserve a second chance. Isaac's bond with Henry deepened as well. The two men often spent quiet afternoons together, Isaac reading aloud from one of Henry's old books or recounting stories from his time in the military. Though Henry couldn't respond verbally, his attentive gaze and occasional nods conveyed a profound connection. One day, as Isaac was recounting a particularly harrowing experience from his deployment, he noticed Henry's eyes glistening with emotion. Isaac paused, unsure if he should continue, but Henry's faint smile encouraged him. For the first time, Isaac felt truly understood, as though Henry's silent presence validated the struggles he had carried for so long. In those moments, something shifted in Isaac. The shame and self-doubt that had plagued him began to loosen their grip, replaced by a growing sense of purpose. He wasn't just helping the Harpers, they were helping him too. The fragile bond they shared, born from a chance encounter and nurtured through shared hardships, became the foundation of something greater. Together, they were learning to heal, to rebuild, and to find hope in the most unexpected places. 2 Chapter 6, Viet Tiep Chapter 7, Voi Noi Dung Dam Bao, 6.000 Key 2, Hey No, Rang Noi Dung Dua Tren Outline D2. Chapter 7, The Community Reacts Bradley's Retaliation. Bradley spreads rumors about Isaac, claiming he is dangerous and unfit to stay in the community. The small town becomes divided, with some supporting Ellie and others siding with Bradley. Ellie's stand. Ellie confronts Bradley at the local diner, delivering a powerful speech about dignity and respect. Her courage inspires others to question their own biases, shifting public sentiment in her favor. The quiet of the small Tennessee town began to stir with a current of whispers and speculation. Bradley Warren had wasted no time spreading his version of events after his confrontation with Isaac at Ray's Market. At the police station, over coffee with friends, and even at his nephew's soccer practice, Bradley painted Isaac as a volatile troublemaker, an unhinged ex-soldier who couldn't hold a job and had a history of insubordination. "He's dangerous," Bradley proclaimed loudly at a booth in the corner of Maggie's Diner, the town's unofficial social hub. He leaned back, his badge catching the light as he gestured for emphasis. "People like him, they don't just snap once. They make it a habit. Mark my words, he's bad news." The small group gathered around him murmured in agreement, their faces a mixture of unease and curiosity. Bradley was a man of influence in the town, and his words carried weight, even if they were laced with exaggeration. But not everyone was swayed. At the far end of the diner, seated near the window, Ellie Harper overheard the conversation. She had come to pick up a takeout order, but the sound of Bradley's booming voice sent her blood boiling. She could feel her pulse quicken, anger simmering just beneath the surface. For days she had worried about Isaac, who had become like a son to her and Henry. Now, hearing Bradley openly smear his name in public, Ellie knew she couldn't stay silent. With a deep breath, she rose from her seat, her movement slow but deliberate. Every eye in the diner seemed to follow her as she approached Bradley's table. The murmurs quieted, replaced by a tense, expectant silence. Even Bradley paused mid-sentence, his smirk fading as he registered her determined expression. "Bradley Warren," Ellie began, her voice firm but measured. "We need to talk." Bradley leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms with a patronizing smile. "Mrs. Harper," he said, his tone dripping with feigned politeness. "What a surprise. What can I do for you?" Ellie didn't flinch. She placed her hands firmly on the edge of the table, meeting his gaze with unwavering intensity. "I couldn't help but overhear you spreading lies about Isaac Thompson." Bradley chuckled, shaking his head. "Lies? Now, I wouldn't call them that. I'm just sharing what the town needs to know. People have a right to be safe." Ellie straightened her back, her voice rising slightly. "Safe? You think you're making people safe by tearing down a young man who's already been through more than most of us can imagine? You think your badge gives you the right to destroy his reputation just because he stood up to your cruelty?" The diner was silent now, the tension palpable. Bradley's smirk wavered, replaced by a flicker of discomfort, but he quickly recovered, his voice sharp and defensive. "I don't know what you're talking about, Mrs. Harper. All I did was call it like I see it. And I see a man who's unstable and a threat to this town." Ellie's hands clenched into fists at her sides, but her voice remained steady. "You saw a man who had the courage to stand up for what's right. You saw someone who wasn't afraid to hold you accountable for the way you treated me that day. And instead of taking responsibility, you decided to tear him down." Bradley opened his mouth to respond, but Ellie cut him off, her voice ringing with righteous conviction. "Isaac Thompson is a war veteran who risked his life for this country. He's a kind, hard-working young man who stepped in to protect me when you were too busy making a mockery of yourself to remember what your job is supposed to be. And now you're trying to punish him for it." She glanced around the diner, her gaze sweeping over the gathered townsfolk who sat frozen in their seats. "How many of you have heard Bradley's stories and taken them at face value? How many of you have bothered to ask Isaac about his side of things? Or me, for that matter? How many of you have judged him without ever trying to understand him?" The weight of her words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. A few people exchanged uneasy glances while others avoided her gaze entirely. Bradley's face reddened, but he remained silent, his jaw clenched. Ellie's voice softened slightly, but it lost none of its strength. "We're better than this," she said, her eyes locking with Bradley's. "Or at least we should be. Respect, dignity, and compassion. Those aren't just words. They're values. And if we let fear and prejudice dictate how we treat people, then we've lost more than Isaac ever could." For a moment, no one spoke. The tension was thick, the atmosphere charged with unspoken realizations. Ellie's words had cut through the noise of Bradley's bravado, leaving the crowd to grapple with their own complicity. Then, slowly, a voice broke the silence. "She's right." All eyes turned to Maggie, the diner's owner, who stood behind the counter with her arms crossed. Her no-nonsense demeanor left little room for argument. "We've all seen Isaac in this town," she continued. "He's polite, hardworking, and never caused trouble, until someone else decided to make trouble for him." A ripple of agreement spread through the room. One by one, other voices joined in. "I saw him helping Ellie the other day," said Tom, the hardware store owner. "Carried a whole load of supplies for her without being asked." "And didn't he fix the church's roof last month?" added Martha, the pastor's wife. "Volunteered to do it for free, if I remember right." Bradley's smug expression crumbled as the tide of public opinion began to shift. He looked around, his eyes narrowing as he realized he was losing his audience. Ellie turned back to him, her gaze steady. "You can keep spreading your lies, Bradley, but people are starting to see the truth. And the truth is, you're not half the man Isaac Thompson is." With that, she straightened her cardigan and walked back to the counter, her steps slow but purposeful. The diner buzzed with murmurs as the crowd digested what had just happened. Bradley sat stiffly in his chair, his fists clenching and unclenching as his authority slipped further from his grasp. As Ellie collected her takeout order and stepped outside, the cool air hit her like a balm, soothing the fire that had burned within her moments ago. She felt a rush of satisfaction, not just for standing up to Bradley, but for giving Isaac the defense he deserved. Later that evening, as she recounted the encounter to Isaac and Henry at the dinner table, Isaac's expression shifted from shock to quiet gratitude. His eyes glistened, though he quickly looked away, his voice thick with emotion. "You didn't have to do that," he murmured. "But, thank you." Ellie reached across the table, placing a hand over his. "You stood up for me, Isaac," she said gently. "It was my turn to stand up for you." For the first time in a long while, Isaac felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps this town wasn't as divided as Bradley wanted it to be. Perhaps there was still room for kindness, for understanding, for second chances. And as Ellie sat back in her chair, a faint but triumphant smile on her lips, she knew they had taken the first step toward healing, not just for Isaac, but for the community as a whole. The morning sunlight filtered through the curtains of Ellie's modest home, casting a warm glow over the kitchen where Isaac sat nursing a cup of coffee. The house had become a sanctuary for him, a place where he could begin to rebuild the shattered pieces of his life. Across the table, Ellie set down a plate of toast and smiled at him, her quiet encouragement serving as a constant reminder that he wasn't alone. Isaac had taken her words to heart after the confrontation with Bradley. For years, he had ignored the part of himself that needed healing, burying the pain and trauma of his past under layers of denial and solitude. But Ellie's steadfast support and Henry's silent strength had given him the courage to take the first step. That week, Isaac made an appointment with a local therapist who specialized in working with veterans. The session was daunting at first. Sitting across from a stranger and peeling back the layers of his experiences felt raw and vulnerable. But the therapist's calm demeanor and empathetic questions created a space where Isaac could finally begin to unpack the weight he'd carried for so long. They talked about the things he had seen overseas, the guilt he harbored for surviving when others hadn't, and the anger he felt toward the world for moving on without him. "You're not broken, Isaac," the therapist had said during one session. "You're healing, and healing takes time." In addition to therapy, Isaac joined a support group for veterans at the community center. The group met twice a week in a small, unassuming room with folding chairs arranged in a circle. The first time he attended, Isaac sat quietly, listening to the stories of other veterans who had faced similar struggles. Their openness inspired him, and by the third meeting, he found himself sharing his own story. The camaraderie of the group, the shared understanding that didn't require words, became a lifeline for him. At home, Ellie noticed the subtle changes in Isaac. He stood a little taller, his shoulders less burdened by the invisible weight he carried. He began to smile more, the corners of his mouth lifting in quiet moments of connection with Ellie and Henry. He still had difficult days, nights when the memories crept in and the darkness felt overwhelming, but he faced them with a new sense of determination. While Isaac worked on himself, the town was abuzz with a different kind of transformation. A local journalist, Rachel Whitman, had been quietly investigating Bradley Warren after the diner incident. Rachel was known for her tenacity, and she had heard enough rumors about Bradley to warrant a closer look. What she uncovered was damning, a history of misconduct that had been swept under the rug, from excessive force complaints to instances of unprofessional behavior in public. The town's small newspaper published Rachel's exposé on a Friday morning. The headline, bold and unforgiving, Officer Bradley Warren, a pattern of abuse? The article detailed multiple incidents, including first-hand accounts from citizens who had been on the receiving end of Bradley's arrogance and intimidation. It didn't take long for the story to spread, igniting outrage among the community. Public backlash against Bradley was swift and unforgiving. Calls flooded the police department demanding accountability, and under pressure, the sheriff announced that Bradley would be suspended pending a formal investigation. The news sent shockwaves through the town, marking a turning point that left many questioning their blind trust in authority. Ellie read the article aloud to Isaac and Henry over breakfast, her voice tinged with satisfaction. "Looks like people are finally starting to see the truth," she said, setting the newspaper down with a triumphant smile. Isaac nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's not just about Bradley," he said. "This town needed a wake-up call. Maybe now they'll start thinking twice about how they treat people." The ripple effects of the scandal created an opportunity for change, and Ellie knew they had to seize it. That weekend, the community center hosted a town hall event, inviting citizens to share their thoughts on how to rebuild trust and foster unity. Ellie and Isaac were asked to speak, a request that both humbled and intimidated them. The event drew a large crowd, the room buzzing with anticipation as people took their seats. Ellie sat beside Isaac in the front row, her hands folded neatly in her lap. When their names were called, she stood first, gripping the edges of the podium as she addressed the crowd. "I want to tell you a story," she began, her voice steady but emotional. "It's a story about kindness, courage, and the power of standing up for what's right. A few weeks ago, I went to the grocery store to pick up a few things. What should have been a simple errand turned into one of the most humiliating experiences of my life. But in that moment, when I felt small and powerless, someone stood up for me." She turned to Isaac, her gaze warm and encouraging. "Isaac Thompson didn't know me, but he chose to defend my dignity when others looked away. And that act of kindness changed everything." The crowd was silent, hanging on her every word. Ellie's voice grew firmer as she continued. "This town is better than the divisions and prejudices that have been allowed to take root. We have the power to choose kindness, to stand up against injustice, and to create a community we can all be proud of. But it starts with us, each and every one of us." Ellie stepped back, her heart pounding as the audience erupted into applause. She glanced at Isaac, who gave her a small nod before stepping up to the podium himself. Isaac cleared his throat, his hands gripping the sides of the podium as he looked out at the crowd. "I'm not a man of many words," he began, his voice low but steady. "But I know what it's like to feel invisible, to carry burdens that no one else can see, and I know what it's like to lose hope." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. "But then someone shows you kindness, and it reminds you that you're not alone, that your story matters, that you matter. That's what Ellie and Henry have done for me." His voice grew stronger, his conviction evident. "We can all be that person for someone else. It doesn't take much, just a little courage, a little compassion. And together we can make this town a place where everyone feels seen and valued." The room erupted into applause again, louder this time, as Ellie and Isaac stepped away from the podium. People approached them afterward, some with tears in their eyes, thanking them for their words and vowing to do better. That night, as they returned home, Ellie, Isaac, and Henry sat together in the living room, the glow of the fireplace casting warm shadows on the walls. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was a sense of hope, a belief that things could change, not just for them, but for the entire community. The crisp morning air carried a sense of renewal as Isaac stepped into the modest building that housed the town's newly established Veteran Outreach Center. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the rows of desks and the warm, inviting posters that lined the walls. "You are not alone, and together we heal." For the first time in years, Isaac felt a sense of purpose that wasn't clouded by doubt or fear. He had landed the job only a week ago, following an interview that left him feeling both hopeful and apprehensive. The role was simple in title, but profound in scope, helping veterans navigate the often complicated systems for housing, employment, and mental health resources. It was a position that allowed Isaac to use his own experiences to guide others, a chance to turn his struggles into something meaningful. As he adjusted the nameplate on his desk, Isaac Thompson, Outreach Coordinator, he allowed himself a small, proud smile. This was where he belonged. He knew it now, with a certainty that had eluded him for years. Ellie and Henry's unwavering support had carried him to this moment, and he was determined to make the most of it. His first appointment of the day was with a man named Tom Greer, a middle-aged veteran who had recently lost his job and was on the brink of losing his home. Tom sat across from Isaac, his shoulders hunched and his eyes darting nervously around the room. "I've been at rock bottom before," Isaac said gently, his voice steady and reassuring. "And I can tell you, it doesn't have to end here. Let's figure this out together." For the next hour, Isaac worked with Tom to map out a plan, his calm demeanor and empathetic approach putting the man at ease. By the time they finished, Tom was smiling for the first time since he'd arrived. "Thank you," Tom said, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't think anyone cared." Isaac met his gaze, his own eyes shining with conviction. "You'd be surprised how many people care. Sometimes you just have to let them." By the end of the day, Isaac had helped 3 other veterans, each with their own stories of hardship and resilience. As he locked up the office and stepped out into the fading light of the evening, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He was no longer just surviving, he was thriving, building a future that felt worthwhile. Back at home, Ellie was folding laundry in the living room, her hands moving methodically as her mind wandered. The house felt quieter than usual without Isaac bustling about, fixing things or sharing stories with Henry. She glanced over at her husband, who was propped up in his bed near the window. Though his body remained still, his eyes followed her movements, their familiar spark of curiosity and affection ever present. "We've come a long way, haven't we, Henry?" Ellie murmured, her voice soft and reflective. She placed the neatly folded towels on a chair and moved to sit beside him, taking his hand in hers. She thought back to that fateful day at the grocery store, the humiliation she had felt, and the unexpected kindness that had followed. Isaac's courage had changed everything, not just for her but for their entire family. He had given her back her dignity, and in turn, she and Henry had given him a place to belong. Ellie smiled, her gaze drifting to the photographs on the mantel. Among them was a new addition, a candid shot of Isaac standing beside Henry's bed, both men grinning as Ellie captured the moment. It was a reminder of how much their lives had intertwined, how their shared struggles had forged an unbreakable bond. "I never thought," Ellie continued, her voice tinged with wonder, "that opening our home to a stranger would lead to so much healing for all of us." Henry's eyes crinkled at the corners, his silent agreement filling the room with an unspoken warmth. Ellie leaned closer, pressing a gentle kiss to his forehead. "You were right, as always," she whispered. "Sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness can change everything." Later that evening, the sound of the front door opening brought Ellie out of her thoughts. Isaac stepped inside, his face flushed from the cool night air but lit with a quiet joy. "Hey there," he greeted, his smile widening as he set down his bag. "Sorry I'm late. I lost track of time at the center." Ellie waved him over, her expression radiating pride. "You've got nothing to apologize for. Come on, dinner's almost ready." The 3 of them gathered in the cozy dining room, the table set with simple but hearty dishes. Isaac regaled them with stories from his day, his laughter filling the space as Ellie and Henry listened intently. It felt natural, effortless, like a family that had always been meant to find each other. After dinner, they moved to the living room, where Ellie settled into her favorite armchair with a knitting project, and Isaac pulled a book from the shelf. At Henry's silent urging, he began to read aloud, his voice rich and expressive as he brought the story to life. Ellie paused her knitting to watch them, her heart swelling with a gratitude so profound it left her breathless. The room was filled with laughter and warmth, the kind of peace that had once felt elusive. Henry's eyes shone with contentment, his faint smile a testament to the quiet strength that had carried them all through the darkest of times. As the evening wore on and the fire in the hearth began to dim, Ellie leaned back in her chair, her hands resting in her lap. She closed her eyes, letting the gentle cadence of Isaac's voice and the rhythmic click of her knitting needles lull her into a state of tranquility. This was their new beginning, a life rebuilt not through grand gestures but through the quiet, steadfast acts of love and support that bound them together. They had found healing not in isolation but in each other, their shared struggles forging a bond that would carry them forward. And as Isaac's voice filled the room, weaving tales of adventure and triumph, Ellie knew they had created something beautiful. Together, they had turned a moment of pain into a lifetime of possibility, proving that even in the face of hardship, hope could flourish. As we bring this heartfelt journey to a close, I want to leave you with a few questions to reflect on and share your thoughts. What does Isaac's transformation teach us about the power of kindness and second chances? Have you ever witnessed or experienced a moment where someone stood up for what was right, even when it came at a personal cost? How do you think small acts of courage and compassion can ripple out to create change in a community? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories and insights might just inspire someone else today. Thank you for being part of this journey with us.